The Army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upsets civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an Irregular Warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. This is Bill, and welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an Irregular Warfare podcast. This is episode 60, The Military Historian's Craft, Past Tense Imperfect. So I'd like to welcome you again to this fortnightly episode of Chasing Ghosts. You'll notice that I think we've got our cadence back for this new year in 2025. And I wanted to reach out and tell everybody I really appreciate the correspondence that I get, the inquiries or recommendations, things like that. Keep it coming, and thank you for that. I've had many folks reach out to me and ask me where I come by my historian credentials and such, because I do think of myself as an amateur historian, a non-credentialed academic historian by no means whatsoever. I think that many of us, even those of us who are unconscious about it, tend to be historians because historians work by several watchwords, one of which I follow is that if you don't know where you've been, you can't possibly know where you are. And if you don't know those two things, you cannot possibly craft a course into the future, personally or by extension, your observations about what's going to happen with greater mankind. Like with all academic pursuits, and I don't get paid to be an amateur historian or anything of the like, much like my credentialed colleagues in the universities and the academies who are in their sinecures with great remuneration and salaries and protection for their jobs. And they get paid to do something as a day job that I have a day job to support what I do as an avocation. I do want to give a shout out to one of my favorite commanders. That would be Colonel KB, when I had a brief flirtation with what it was like to be an academic at a university proper, when I was an assistant professor of military science at Ole Miss, teaching the cadets there in their third and fourth years while I was still in uniform. One of the best assignments I ever had, and I had this terrific office in which I could finally put all my books, and I have a considerable library in one place in this really nice corner office, and KB let me go about my way in designing courses and seminars and things like that. So I got a taste of academia at that time, but that didn't last very long before I was reassigned overseas. And during that very time, I had flirted with getting a graduate degree in history, took 2 of the courses, and unfortunately, this was before my emergency reassignment overseas from Ole Miss, and I had to curtail that, stop it, and never returned. But I did find some value in one of the courses that I took, and that historical course was all about historiography, documents, primary source documentation, secondary source documentation, interrogating the evidence, and that kind of thing. So that is the only formal course that I took. Now, like most who have gone to college, both undergraduate and graduate, I think a lot of us have taken history courses. I took mine. Only a very few of them I found to be satisfactory. The other ones were simply propaganda megaphones for the faculty at the time, and of course, most faculty in universities. And I went to university in Calazuela in the 1980s, and it was still full-on, full-force government supremacism and collectivism all the time, in spite of the fact, as I have mentioned before, that I was so blessed coincidentally during that time when I was attending what is now known as Humboldt Polytechnic University. I found 2 Austrian economists hiding in the basement of the economics department. They adopted me, and since then it changed my life significantly. I'd like to shout out to them and to KB, who I just mentioned about my short tenure at Ole Miss. My other flirtation with academic historiography and history was when I was invited in 2010 to go to Freedom Fest in Las Vegas and debate Dr. Daniel Walker Howe, Professor Emeritus UCLA, I think, and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, in which the resolve for said debate was, are the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution superior to the maintenance of individual liberty and freedom? And of course, I am one of those geeks in America who not only has read the Articles of Confederation, read all the Anti-Federalist Papers, which I think are superior to the Federalist Papers in every way, as both an instantiation of how to preserve freedom and liberty, but also a forecast into what happens when you don't and you follow the Federalist architecture, and here we find ourselves. And he championed the Constitution. I suspect the reason I was able to best him at the debate is he probably being a busy man. I mean, the man's a professor. He's an emeritus historian. He's quite the prolific author, and I give him props and creds for everything that I did. But he probably looked at my CV and thought that I was just not qualified, not credentialed, not capable of meeting him in the ludus, as it were, to have our battle on the sands over which one was superior. I bested him. I do have a recording of that. I think I posted it elsewhere. And that was a lot of fun. But other than that, my flirtations with formal academic history and historiography is fleeting at best. I am, as I noted earlier, an amateur, non-paid historian. I found, for instance, early on in my job as both, all enlisted man, NCO, and officer in the U.S. Armed Forces, that here I had before me and behind me this 3,000-year-old bloodless practicum of military history that I could pay attention to and read about and find to any depth I wanted, for the most part, of said battles, conflicts, wars, regional conflict complexes, all of these kind of things. Look at the primary source documentation, the secondary source documentation, come to my own decisions and conclusions on what had happened then. And all of this is available to me. And of course, I've been a book buyer and a bibliophile all of my life. I mean, I'm one of those guys who back in the day before the internet carried that little notebook in his pocket that whenever he came across a used bookstore, I'd go in there with my notebook and go through my list of books that I wanted or needed and hadn't found yet and was too cheap to buy brand new, and would look for them in the used bookstore. So I think as a serving member of the armed forces, I thought it was to my advantage, as I've always had something of an academic inclination, to take a look at what was it that informed failure and success in my particular trade and profession at the time. And I spent nearly a quarter century in uniform, both active duty in the reserves. I spent 4 years in the reserves, 20 years active. And I always found it to my advantage, much like I find after-action reviews and even reading old after-action reviews at the units that I served in, that it was so useful to look at the evidence, the stories, the narratives, all of those things that led to all of these complex events that we frame as wars today. So those are some of my inspirations for being an amateur historian. And now, as a conflict futurist, as I like to pattern myself on occasion, I find that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme, as Mark Twain told us. And it pays to look into the future to see, what are we going to do in the future and how do we prepare? Eisenhower, for instance, was all about the planning, and I'm all about the planning. Left of bang, before one enters a conflict of any type. And you have to do that. But it doesn't mean that that plan survives contact, because necessarily it doesn't. But one would be forfeit, if not incompetent, to go into a conflict at any level without a plan in place, no matter how much you may anticipate it will go awry. Because some will tell you that when it comes to the king of battle, it's artillery. Now, mind you, I get that in a kinetic fashion, but I assure you, the king of battle is Murphy. Murphy's Law. Because in the end, as is the catchphrase and axiom for this conflict podcast, along with my companion podcast, War Notes, wars are won by the least incompetent forces engaged. I have lots of personal resources when it comes to my research, to include an almost complete collection of Virginia Military Institute's quarterly issuance of the Journal of Military History, which I recommend to most everybody. Now, you can't read everything that is in there, because what you will find, as is academia's wont now, is that the woke mind virus has even penetrated the military history departments. And I want to take just a moment to reflect on that, and that's this. Military historians are a single-digit percentage, a very small single-digit percentage of all historians nationwide. They do have their own society. They do have their own symposia and meetings annually. They are dwarfed by the meetings of the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians, two organizations that I would never be a member of because they are Marxoid, woke, freighted with presentism. Presentism is a malady and fallacy that so many current historians and observers use, where they take the current chronological place where we live and they project it backwards in their rearview mirror and try to insinuate that the motives that make us human today are the same motives that make you human yesterday, and that is facile, puerile, and infantile, and has nothing to do with the incentives and motivations of human beings in the past. I'm a big Monty Python fan, and I often think that when it comes to the Organization of American Historians, or the American Historical Association, that is the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea, where you have these two Marxoid, wacky, woke groups batting at each other with parasols and handbags, trying to challenge one another to see who can be the most woke and most mentally ill at the time. They consistently try to use the past and use history to serve present political purposes. Almost the entirety of leftist historians are that way. And then you have these wokey faux historians on the right, like Neil Ferguson, who I used to have the greatest respect for, until he started practicing this presentism is the past and using the past to leverage and shoehorn in what his present political objectives are with lessons from the past that simply don't fit. We're going to go down one side street before we continue on, and this one is so important. It is one that I have mentioned in past episodes. If you are a new listener, this will be the first time that you hear it. There were two gentlemen, Hutchinson and Adler, who created the Great Books of the Western World, which was an appendium of great works of literature, both fiction and nonfiction, for Encyclopedia Britannica at the time. They came out with a 54-volume set and a 60-volume set. I urge you only to get the 54-volume set, because when they adopted that 60-volume set, there was some woke platitudinous stuff that went into that really degraded the content of that particular collection. But Mortimer Adler wrote a great book that should be in everyone's library, no matter your profession or avocation, and that is How to Read a Book. Now, it's a big book, and as you know, with all nonfiction books, I tell all my folks who happen to be very busy the very best way to read a book is only nonfiction, of course. You can see why when I tell you what I say next. Read the last chapter first, because it does two things. Number one, it allows you to get a compressed abstract or précis of what the author or authors are after. And number two, if you like it and you approve and you want to get to know more, once you go back to page one and you start and you read the book, in the back of your mind, you have an end state. You have an intention, an intent of what the author is after, and it helps you zero in on that. But I would urge everybody to get that book, read that book, make it your own. Your children and grandchildren, if they're readers, would greatly benefit from using this. I wish, and it was around then, I wish in my youth or my very young adulthood I had had access to this book, because it would have changed the way I interrogated and inquired about the world. He talks about the 4 levels of reading. I won't bore you with those now, because we're only going to concern ourselves with the 4th level of reading, which is syntopical reading. And what syntopical reading is is that as an active reader who is interrogating what they are reading, this isn't fiction, this would be nonfiction for the most part, in which you really want to draw something out of it. He says, read a minimum of 3 to 5 books on the topic of your choice. Could be architecture, could be auto maintenance, could be military history, could be the 30 Years' War in parts of Germany only. Could be any of those, and you find those books. And if you are an active reader and you actually read the connotations and footnotes, maybe even pursue the footnotes as a bridge to another book on the subject to inform those 3 to 5 minimum that you would read, you start to get a sensibility by not only reading in an active fashion, but reading between the lines. And also you'll see that some evidence is not interpreted in the way that other books present it. And then you can achieve, and you can take this phrase to the bank because it will guide you in everything you do, the single most accurate picture. Those 4 words should follow you in any intellectual inquiry that you do, anything that you do for a living, even in your avocations. You want that single most accurate picture of what reality looks like, tells you, and how that's important in your life. This practice of history and historiographer and historian has been around for a long time. One way that I was introduced to the very early ancient histories, for instance, was through, I think his name was Robert Strassler, who edited the landmark ancient histories. This would be the landmark Thucydides, the landmark Herodotus, the landmark Xenophon, and the Julius Caesar, the campaigns of Alexander, things like that. And the thing I like about these is that they're annotated, very nice books, but it shows you that this particular profession, whether professional or amateur, and I think that when it comes to being professional historians, that is probably something that came about after the Middle Ages, maybe during the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. But nonetheless, we find ourselves here where lots of amateur historians, like myself, and I'm not saying I've done important work, but I'm saying lots of amateur historians have done extraordinarily important work when it comes to these kind of things, all the way up to the present. For instance, what you'll find is a former boss of mine, Lieutenant General Dan Bolger, retired, who has written some of my very favorite books. He's an historian in an amateur fashion, and he's done great work when it comes to covering the Iraq campaigns, the Afghan campaigns. There are other conflict observers out there, both in uniform and out, like Douglas Porch, who happens to be a professional historian. I think he's been at the Naval Postgraduate School, who wrote one of the books that inspired my Chasing Ghosts podcast, where he wrote his book, his rather skeptical book about counterinsurgency. I also want to note that when it comes to the profession of military history, like the classics in the U.S. and the West, it is a dying profession. You'd be lucky to find, I'll bet, a dozen programs. I would be happy for my listeners to correct me on this, a dozen formal graduate programs in military history outside of the military academies available in the United States. I think England may have half a dozen. Europe may have others, but this is a very small profession. I just mentioned the classics. The classics are dying as we're speaking. I think those who wish to actually learn Latin and Greek, I know a little bit of Latin, don't know any Greek. We use Latin when we home educated our children as part of their curricula in the trivium. So that's why I have a passing acquaintance with it, but certainly not to the point of being a professional classicist like Victor Davis Hanson or others. And Hanson, of course, is another terrific conflict observer, whether it's now or in the past, with some of his extraordinary work that he did on Greek and Roman fighting formations. Why do I consider myself a more sober historian than most? There are several reasons for this, among which is our personal philosophies and our lives have a great influence on the paths that we follow and the way we apprehend the world. In my case, I would be a small L libertarian. Mind you, probably an abolitionist. I don't use the A word because it is freighted with so much baggage that confuses people to think that you are a member of the left or right. I happen to think that these political connotations of left or right is magical thinking, legerdemain. It's just, failing by direction. I think that you're either an individualist or a collectivist. And if you're a non-interventionist individualist, you're probably in my camp. Why I think this is an advantage for me as a conflict observer, a military historian, an amateur military historian, is because I think I'm rather dispassionate when it comes to ensuring that I am not honing the blade or edge of a particular political party affiliation. I have none. I am not a member of the Libertarian Party. I was a member for 3 months in the 1990s, and that cured me of it because what I discovered is that people trying to use politics to get freedom and liberty is much like cannibals trying to rid the world of cannibalism by eating the cannibals. So because I don't have a political dog in the fight with a party affiliation, I honestly think at an unconscious and a conscious level, it makes me a more sober observer of conflict. For instance, what we find today is that when it comes to the fight in the Ukraine and the fight in Russia, many will say, I'm all for Ukraine, or many will say, lesser will say, I am all for Russia. And the automatic assumption is, so if you're against the Ukraine, you're a Putin stooge. But if you're against Russia and you're talking to people who happen to be Russophiles and happen to think that what is happening there is correct, they'll say, you're a Zelensky stooge. For me, I have a third market, which is that I am neither a Zelensky or a Putin stooge. I just don't have a dog in the hunt. I don't think it is the U.S., much less the West business. Well, Europe can take their decisions themselves. Everybody who's listened to me perennially knows how I feel about NATO. Get out now, get out tomorrow morning, get out soonest. But in this case, because I don't have a dog in the hunt, I think I can look at it with a little more objectivity and a note on objectivity. As you know, if you've listened to me before, or if this is the first time that you're hearing my voice, what you'll know is that I consider objectivity to be a myth. It's a chimera. It doesn't exist. What I have is my bias filters. What everybody else has is their bias filters. It's one reason why I urge everybody not to watch the news. There's a reason they call it programming. And all of these Doge discoveries of late with government subsidy of the narrative, even with scary titles like narrative exploitation and narrative shaping on the very contracts that were signed by the media organizations with the United States government and other entities, quite scary. So I always tell people, read editorials and opinion pieces. Go to the left, go to the right. And by the way, I know what I just said about left and right, but because people aren't acquainted with the bifurcation that I employ, I will employ, for the sake of the lion's share of my audience, left and right, as a distinguishing bifurcation on how to apprehend the world politically. In this case, I can look at the fight and clearly see that Russia, from the very beginning, had the advantage in all of this for a variety of socio-political, economic, and military reasons. As a matter of fact, I found myself in a room with a bunch of other analysts at the time, and this is 1 month into the special military operation. They canvassed the room to get initial impressions, in which the question was, will Russia reach a stalemate or victory in this war against the Ukraine? And of course, this is where we all had the surety of the onrush of U.S. and Western military supplies in great numbers to the Ukrainians and everything else that was going on at the time. I was the only one in the room with 36 people there canvassed who said that in the end, the Russians would prevail, whether stalemate or victory. The only one. Again, I don't chalk this up to my prescience. I chalk it up to my rather dispassionate viewpoint, not being party affiliated, to make better forecasts. A word on forecast and predictions. If you've listened to me before, you've heard this, but if you're a new listener, you haven't, and that is this. You will hear me forecast, but you won't hear me predict, because prediction is freighted with a higher level of evidentiary burden than forecasting is. And why else do I think that I am a savvy observer? Well, I'll give you a few points. Number one, altruism is always a lie, no matter what you think and what they told you at university. People will always act in their self-interest. One thing I learned from Gordon Tullock, who is a key figure in public choice theory, and that has been aligned with Austrian economics. You can look that up. I happen to be an Austrian economist by training. It is a free market school of economics, unlike the Keynesians, the Marxists, the supply-siders, and all the rest of them. So he championed public choice theory, which pioneered by Tullock and James Buchanan. What this does is it applies economic principles to the study of political and social decision-making. It views individuals, including politicians and bureaucrats, as rational actors pursuing their own self-interest, even within the public sphere. Here are the key assumptions. Self-interest. Public choice theory assumes that individuals, whether in the market or in politics, are primarily motivated by self-interest. Rationality. Individuals are assumed to act rationally, making choices to maximize their own utility or benefit. And incentives matter. Public choices emphasizes the importance of incentives and how they influence behavior in both private and public sectors. Now, a lot of you may make assumptions here where you say, well, Bill, that's from the University of the Intuitively Obvious. Of course people are driven by incentives. Well, my hat's off to you. You are correct. But there are folks in our society who think that when politicians are elected to office, that they're there to serve the public weal and good. They're there to represent their constituents. They're there to do the high-minded things that their constituents had in mind when they installed them in the elective office in the first place. That is not the case. That is so far from the truth. And as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the Department of Government Efficiency and what they are revealing in the government, and of course the reaction to that, one is seeing that self-interest is and always will be the primary the primary motive of all elected and unelected political creatures in political ecosystems. And let's remember Bupert's corollary to Acton's axiom that power attracts the corruptible and absolute power attracts even worse. So take these two ideas that I just parked in your brain, what I just said and what I was talking about when it comes to public choice theory, and extend that to all of your understanding of what you've been told about the past. How many times have you been told that politicians always selflessly and in no self-interest whatsoever, what they do is they advance these agendas that prove out to be not so good for those who are the victims of said agendas, but all the words were so pretty at the beginning when they proposed to do these very things. So public choice's focus when it comes to this, and this is Tullock again and Buchanan, is that political processes like voting, lobbying, and bureaucratic decision-making affect outcomes. I am fond of saying that atomistic voting, casting your ballot at the ballot box, doesn't count for much, and that the most effective form of voting is lobbying. Rent-seeking. It was Tullock, by the way, who developed the concept of rent-seeking, where individuals or groups try to gain wealth or power through political influence rather than through productive activities. This would also be the difference between economic entrepreneurship and political entrepreneurship. When you have members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who have managed to amass millions of dollars in their net worth over time, and you wonder, where does that money come from? Well, for the most part, it comes from this rent-seeking and the Rolodex leverage that they have to ensure that they become much richer on a very low salary than they would have otherwise. And of course, institutional design. Public choice suggests that institutional design, including rules and regulations, can influence the behavior of individuals and the outcomes of political processes. All of us who are either in bureaucracies, adjacent to bureaucracies, or victims of them every day when we seek to purchase things in either the market or maybe paying our taxes or getting things done at DMV or whatever the case may be. Those institutional design frameworks aren't for effectiveness. They aren't for efficiency. They are for the maintenance and expansion of that bureaucracy's will, that bureaucracy's existence, and that bureaucracy's ability to have tremendous influence, effect, and rent-seeking capability over you as an individual or a member of groups that you're in. So now, with that in mind as a preamble, we can examine a little more structurally what it is I do and how I do it when it comes to this podcast. I do look to the past to try to find things that are going to fit within the explanatory frameworks that I'm trying to get a single most accurate picture on. Now, while I am so happy to have an audience for Chasing Ghosts and a Regular Warfare podcast and War Notes, my companion conflict podcast, there are lots of folks out there who I suspect have much more talent, much more resources, and much more research leverage than I do. For instance, Dan Carlin at Hardcore History does a terrific job as long as he sticks to history, because the moment he starts talking about politics, he tends to ask all the right questions and then veer into the wrong answers almost by rote. There's other folks out there who I really admire, for in particular Daryl Cooper, who runs the Martyr Made podcast, who has just done some extraordinary historical work as an amateur historian. Sometimes he comes on to Jocko's podcast as a guest. He has his own podcast, which I can't recommend highly enough. Remember, for instance, right now, he is doing a podcast on the Germans during World War II. He is getting a lot of flack because World War II is a fulcrum narrative for the West to assume triumphalist goodwill, good intentions, and the ultimate best outcomes of war making in the West. World War II seems to be that myth-making machine, and there's a lot of myths that are made and swallowed by Americans and Westerners alike when it comes to World War II. But he's doing us a great service by asking questions from a different direction. And of course, he's being labeled a Nazi apologist or anything like that. But what we have to remember about historical inquiry is that it is so important to curb your dogma. It is so important for us to try to set aside the best we can those things that allow us to make sacred cows the best burgers, because they are. If one views history in a prismatic fashion in which you're trying to red team, steel man, contrarian, 10th man, these historical questions, small and large, where you try to get into the head doing what's called red thread analysis or red team analysis, get into the head of the other guy who doesn't happen to be on your team and try to suss out the incentives, try to establish what drove them to do what they do. No one on Earth, in all of Earth's conflict and wartime history, has started a war and thought, well, this will take years or decades. No, they all think it'll just take a couple weeks and everything will be solved. Well, things aren't easy like that, as we discovered, for instance, with World War II, where we have Winston Churchill, who I also consider to be a flawed and failed historical figure for so many reasons, but not being prime minister yet in September 1939, but having the ears of those who were in the 10 Downing Street chambers making these decisions, was all aboard to go to war with the Germans, not with the Russians, who met them in the middle in September 1939, but only with the Germans. And this very same Churchill, when assuming the mantle of prime minister, finds himself in 1944 and 1945 in a very cozy relationship with the communist Joseph Stalin in the USSR, and he hands Poland and a lion's share of Eastern Europe to the USSR, which had happened to be the pretense and casus belli for starting the UK as members of the Allies and fighting the Germans in the first place. Politics and war make for very strange bedfellows. So I want to run through a few examples, for instance, of why having a military background and being a military historian gives you an advantage. So there's a fellow by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Mike Snook, who wrote 2 books, How Can Men Die Better and Like Wolves in the Fold. How Can Men Die Better was about the Battle of Asandulwana in Africa in 1879. Like Wolves in the Fold is about the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which some of you may have seen portrayed in the movie Zulu, one of my favorite movies with Michael Caine. I think one of his first starring performances, and he did a splendid job. But one of the valuable things here is that here you have a career military man, Mike Snook, and he goes down there and he actually walks the terrain, because one thing that you find about military operations is that military operations are about many, many things, but 2 things that come to mind when I think about Snook is terrain and angles. It's all about those 2 things. Now, of course, here we are in the 19th century, and he actually walked the terrain. He walked it with the kit. And then, of course, when I talk about angles, what I'm talking about is angles of observation and angles of fire and why that's so important. And he addresses those things here. As a military historian, not having served in the military, he may have just avoided or forgotten or not even known about those qualities when it came to the analysis that he gave his readers considering that fight. Another example is one of my new favorite historians of the Russians and the Germans on the Eastern Front in World War II. That would be David Stahel, who is quite prolific. I have 4 of his books. I've read 4 of his books. He has others. And as a serving military officer and a sober historian, I always looked at the German Wehrmacht and, of course, its predecessor, the Reichswehr, in World War I, as extraordinary fighting formations at the tactical and operational levels. And in spite of military historians on the General Staff and the OKH, which was the German General Staff at the time, strategic and grand strategic decisions were just awful across the board for the most part. So I always had this sense that if the Germans were so good at that level, so they weren't able to leverage it into success. And then Stahel wrote his book, Operation Barbarossa and Germany's Defeat in the East. And of course, this would be in the summer of 1941, where Germany thought for many reasons that it would quickly subsume Russia and then be able to focus on reconstituting and securing all of its victories in Western Europe and taking possession of the continent without having any threat at their back door, as it were. Well, what one discovers is that there's this German concept called Auftragstaktik, which means mission command, which means that there is a reliance in the German army since 1805, by the way, in which they have honed this to a very keen and sharp edge where a commander in the field is given the intent. He is given the end state. He is given what his commanders back in the OKH and at the strategic level want him to achieve, and he is to do that there, and he's not going to be micromanaged, which means that he's going to be not told how to do the job, but he is going to be resourced, possibly, in all the ways possible to make sure that he can reach his objective. And we discover several things here, and this is a result of Stahel's not only secondary source documentation that he employs, but he's a German speaker, so he was able to go into the German archives and actually read firsthand a lot of the orders and after-action reports and such. And what we discover is that with Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest military invasions in the history of mankind until later on in the war, he discovers that once maneuver warfare stops and attrition warfare starts, in other words, once it's a third-gen war that turns into a second-generation war, where it is at a standstill and practically trench warfare on occasion, or investments in large cities in which the clashes are block by block, they don't fare very well. And another reason that they don't fare very well is not only because they hadn't trained for that kind of warfare, because they had this spectacular blitzkrieg triumph at the wholesale level across all of Western Europe with a few speed bumps in some countries. I mean, we see France fall in 6 weeks in 1940. And in this case, it was the logistics that caused so many problems, because there's this old saw by Tom Clancy where he says that amateurs are concerned with tactics and that professionals are concerned with logistics. And my friend Doug Nussbaum out at the Naval Postgraduate School has a third addendum to that, in which he says that wars are won by energy, and I agree with that 100%. And the Allies had that in spades, and the Axis powers didn't have that at all, nor the planning for it. He goes into excruciating details with these order of battle lists in which, for instance, in a motorcycle battalion, there could be dozens of makes and models. And when it came to vehicular traffic, they had trucks that were built by Germans, built by the French, built by other Europeans and such, that they brought to the front. And you can imagine that if these are all different manufacturers and you're subject to the just awful Russian conditions in the winter with cold, the awful Russian conditions in the summer, which is dust and heat, and you have all these different makes and models and various different engineering philosophies in the fabrication of vehicles, it led to tremendous stand-down stalls and problems trying to keep all these vehicles moving. Of course, most of you are probably aware that 80% of all logistics in World War II practiced by the Germans was horse-borne, and that one of the reasons after the war there was such a horse shortage is because 2.5 million horses died during World War II, most of whom died under German usage. Now, what we find here, for a variety of reasons, and I would urge you to read Sean McMeekin's book, Stalin's War, and how logistically at the operational, strategic, and grand strategic level, the Russians were able to build as much as they did with a lot of U.S. and Allied help. As a matter of fact, the T-34 has a suspension design that was designed in Detroit, if I remember correctly. That T-34 was probably the best tank fielded during the entire war. Despite all the noise that you hear about the German tanks and their superiority, the Germans have a penchant for complex over-engineering and over-complexification, and this found that when they would build extraordinary tanks like the Tiger tank, not only did they have very short range because they were such fuel hogs, but that they would break down. T-34s, rather simple, made with U.S. parts also, but just built to last, built to take the brunt of damage, and very simple in their application, their engineering, and their execution. What really distinguished between the two armies when it came to tank fighting was the tank crews. The tank crews of the Germans were clearly the best in the world, but what would have happened counterfactually if that they had designed something on the order of the T-34, which didn't have the German overcomplexification, which wasn't a fuel hog, which didn't have all the logistical, mechanical, and maintenance problems that did. Who knows? Counterfactuals are fun to entertain, but in this case, we know what happened, and that is that in the summer of 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, the German army lost and took 4 years to perish by April-May 1945. And then we find ourselves considering that those of us who were in uniform were almost uniformly batted about the head to be told that U.S. way of war superior, Russian way of war not superior, Russian way of war bad because it doesn't work, because it's artillery-centric, because they can't build good aircraft, because they can't do these kind of things, because they don't have a blue water surface navy, because they don't have aircraft carriers. And it was beaten into us that American superiority in so many ways, without steel manning, without red teaming, that it would be a walk in the park. for the Warsaw Pact to be defeated, for the Soviet forces to be defeated. Of course, the lie in that was during the 1980s, there was a first-use nuclear policy by the U.S. allies, the U.S. and its allies, because they knew that they could not defeat conventionally what they saw arrayed before them across the Fulda Gap during the 1980s before the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, if we take a look at Russian tactics from 1943 to 1945, we find this extraordinary transformation, probably one of the most significant army transformations in the history of armed conflict, where we see this Russian army defeated time and again for almost 2 years straight, trading time for space and space for time, and then they're transforming themselves in the back lines, and they're starting to push back. And from 1943 to 1945, it is nothing more than a Red Army bulldozer against which 4/5 of all German order of battle was arrayed against them, even after June 1944, to keep the bear from breaching the back door in German possessions in Germany proper and taking them out of the conflict entirely. We fast forward to what the Chinese did using Russian tactics in 1950 and 51 in Korea. We find that, wow, that's pretty impressive. We find that we can look at the Middle East, where there was a preponderance of Russian military doctrine informing what they did, but there's other reasons for the manifest failures of that, and I've covered that in the past when I talked about Kenneth Pollock's treatment in Armies of Sand, where he says, as far as conventional formations are concerned, when it comes to Islamist and Arab armies, they simply don't have what it takes to deal with peer competitors for a variety of reasons. We fast forward yet again to the Cuban conduct of operations in their own Cuban variant of Russian doctrine in Africa from 1976 to 1988. And we find that it was a near-run thing for the South Africans in Angola, and that the Cubans were extraordinarily very able combatants in that theater. And you would do well to look into that and see what you think and what conclusions you arrive at. So the reason why I've brought up Lieutenant Colonel Snook, the Australian researcher David Stahel, extraordinary work, and then what I just discussed concerning the Russian way of war, is that all of us have blinders. All of us have perception biases that cause us, when we're looking at conflicts in toto or conflicts separately, we need to really, like I mentioned before, curb our dogma and be careful in our analyses that we're coming to the right conclusions, because history isn't simply dates and times. Those dates and times are a result of cause and effect. And most of the time, that cause and effect goes way back. For instance, we will find that historically, U.S. intervention in World War I in 1918 probably gave us World War II. Now, why do I say that? Well, I'm going to illustrate that with a simple riddle, which I was quite amused at. And it was about a time cop who goes back in time, and he reports back once he returns, and he says, "I couldn't find baby Hitler, but I did kill Woodrow Wilson," to which the time cop captain responds, "Who's Adolf Hitler?" So I know that seems rather short and flippant, but nonetheless, there's a lot to be pulled apart from that. By the way, if you are interested in who Patient Zero is for the way the world is today, as bad as it is when it comes to where we are as a people and where we are in conflicts, Woodrow Wilson is Patient Zero for that. And I would urge you to go to Prof. CJ's Dangerous History podcast, and he's done a multi-part history examining why Woodrow Wilson was so bad domestically, so bad generationally, and so bad internationally, in that we can't say that he was the root cause, but he was certainly a proximate cause, if not an adjacent root cause, to what happened to the world in the 20th century. I also assign Churchill a very high place in that order because of so many of his missteps since he assumed the Lord of the Admiralty in World War I, everything in between that and World War II, and what he did after World War II. I don't agree with Darryl Cooper, who I think was being hyperbolic when he called Churchill the chief villain of World War II. But I do think he was a chief villain of World War II. Exhibit A for me is Operation Keelhaul. Look it up. So I almost said historian's burden. This is no burden. This is something that I really enjoy doing. But one burden that we have on us is burden of proof. And we need to examine things in a very, not only philosophical, but analytical fashion. I always have to employ what I talked to you about with Adler's active reading, interrogating my sources, finding footnotes, following the breadcrumb trail in those footnotes. For instance, I was listening to Sean McMeekin's Stalin's War on Audible, and I was so agog and aghast at the breadth, depth, and just surprising evidence that he presented. I bought the book so that I would have access to the footnotes, so I could chase the footnotes down to see where those led and where those breadcrumb trails would reveal for me. So when you take that and you start to steel man, contrarian, 10th man, red team, and prismatically view history not only from your side and your biases, but you try to interrogate the bias filters of those on the other side, and you try to assess what is their evidence and how good is that evidence. I mean, Socratic drilling works well. There was a Toyota engineer by the name of Ono who used Ono's 5 whys, in which that he would ask why 5 or more times, not only to figure out if the person he was speaking to knew what they were talking about, but maybe even to use that means to sort of analytically and diagnostically try to find the best evidence for that single most accurate picture. So, thanks for listening. I thought I would do this podcast to give you a window into the addled mind of an amateur historian. I would appreciate any feedback, recommendations, questions that you may have. You can reach me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That's cgpodcast@pm.me. Or you can go to my Substack. You will find all of that in the show notes. And, of course, thanks for listening. Thanks for your solicitude. And as always, please mention to friends and colleagues, family, if you like this. And if you get a chance to leave a review, I'm much obliged. This is Bill, out.